Okay, we're going to talk about insects this afternoon. Now, I'm a parasitologist, not a parapsychologist. Sometimes when people misunderstand when I say parapsychologist, and they start telling me about their brother-in-law and about things that I don't really want to know, and before I know it, no, I've heard too much. So I study parasites, okay? I'm a parasitologist. You don't have to go to France to study parasites. And so I'm not going to talk too much about parasites. I'm not going to talk at all about parasites this morning because it's too near lunch, right? You don't want to talk about parasites just before you eat, especially if you're going to have ramen or spaghetti. That was another joke. And so that's my field, is parasitology. But being a parasitologist, you have to know quite a bit about insects, because insects are what we call the arthropod vectors. They're intermediate hosts to a number of parasites. For example, Chagas disease. Have you ever heard of Chagas disease in South America? It's spread by something called the kissing bug, the rejuvenated bug. And the metacyclic trypanosomes are exited from the bug and then get into the mucous membranes of the victim. Very, very tragic disease that is making headway in the United States. Now, back when I was in graduate school, that was not the case, but as time has gone on, we see that the rejuvenated bugs, Chagas disease, is inexorably moving north. And so I've done a presentation to ICR staff in regard to Chagas disease. There's also malaria. You've all heard of malaria, right? There's about 5 species of plasmodium that infects people. About 2 million people a year die of malaria. Very, very tragic. Most of them in Africa, most of them children. And so you have to know a little bit about insects, these, as I say, arthropod vectors that spread the immature stage of the parasite to the definitive host, whether it's an animal or a person. Well, last night I talked about Romans 1:20 and the fact that God's creation is what, class? 2 words, help me out. Clearly seen. Very good. You're very good. It's clearly seen creation. And so insects have about 3 pair of legs, and usually 2 pair of wings borne on what we call the thorax of the creature. There's 750,000 living species at least, probably twice as many as that, representing about 10% of all the species on Earth. Just before lunchtime. Oh, yummy, yummy. I want to share with you something that an individual said who's not a creationist, who was pretty sarcastic in regard to the book of Leviticus, chapter 11 and verse 21. Here's what Leviticus chapter 11 says. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all 4s, those which have jointed legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. And down the hatch there. This is close to lunch, right? Okay. And that's found in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 3 and verse 4. Here's what a guy by the name of Dr. Gilbert Waldbauer said. He's a professor, emeritus professor of the Department of Entomology. Entomology is a study of insects at the University of Illinois, by the way, which is my home state. He said, and I quote, "The specification of creeping things that go on all 4s is a bit confusing," he said. "Insects have 6 legs, but the author of Leviticus seems not to have noticed that," he sarcastically stated. And so how about it? Did Moses say that insects have only 4 legs? Well, let's look at it. First of all, we look at online entomology topic here, and we see that grasshoppers have walking legs, and what else, class? Jumping legs. So they have walking legs and jumping legs, as you see by the red circle there. And so here Waldbauer is saying the specification of creeping things that goes on all 4 is a bit confusing. Insects have 6 legs, but the author of Leviticus seems not to have noticed that. Well, let's look at another entomologist and see what this entomologist had to say. The first 2 pairs of a grasshopper's legs are of the walking type, but the hind legs are very evidently modified for jumping. Well, who said that? None other than Dr. Gilbert Waldbauer in his book, The Handy Bug Answer Book, Visible Press, there in Detroit. And so here he almost answered, well, he did answer his own question. Let's see now. Let's do the math. Does anybody have a pocket calculator? 4 walking legs plus 2 hind hopping legs gives you how many legs total, class? 6 legs. As a great American philosopher, Gomer Pyle, said, surprise, surprise. Anybody who's old enough to remember Gomer Pyle? And so, yeah, 4 plus 2 equals 6. Very good. Yeah, okay, very good. And so this is the kind of thing that we run into constantly in creation science circles. Well, this is a tree lobster from Ball's Pyramid in the Tasmanian Sea, kind of significant. This is not Photoshop. It's not clip art. These creatures really exist. They're the heaviest flightless stick insects in the world. And of course the walking stick as well, very well camouflaged in the far left-hand picture there, but the walking stick can be seen on this individual's arm. Very, very fascinating creatures these insects are. There's a beetle that water skis so fast it appears to vanish. A video clip in New Scientist magazine just recently showing the water lily beetle in slow motion. A human skiing at a comparable pace would go 310 miles an hour. Whoa! These are the largest, the fastest speeds ever measured for any insect on the water. So these insects continue to amaze us with their various abilities that they have. Here we have a mosquito in Talbot County, Maryland, and a very significant individual there. Female mosquitoes are the only ones that bite you. They need a protein meal with which to produce eggs, and in zoology we call them ova. So the male mosquito, of course, doesn't go for the carotid, doesn't go for the blood. It goes after nectar of flowers. Typical male, just kind of mellow, goes and gets a nice nectar meal there. And the female, yes, goes for the carotid. They go for the blood there. And so for all of you that like to go on a date in the evening and get bit by a mosquito, just take that mosquito, hold it up to the moonlight, and tell your date, female. And you'd be right. Okay. Well, anyway. And by the way, speaking of creation evolution, and what about God's very good creation, they're now finding there's a number of species of mosquitoes, male and female, that do not require a blood meal, but get their protein sources from other places. Well, when we look at these very formidable insects here, where did insects come from? What was their origin? By the way, Chris did an outstanding job this morning in presenting to you Geology 101, especially in terms of flood geology as applies to the flood, Genesis chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 8. And, I'm not a fan of mathematics, but I really do appreciate my friend Dr. DeYoung in giving us kind of an overview of math as it applies to the Bible, as it applies to history and science, and he brought that together beautifully. So I'm going to have to work hard to follow such really good presentations this morning. What was the name of Darwin's infamous book? Origin of Species. What year was it published? Every Christian should know what year Darwin's book was published. 1859. What's one thing that Darwin never talked about? The origin of the species. Why? Why was Darwin's book so popular in 1859 as it is popular today? Well, it wasn't because it was so scientific. Darwin talked a lot about minor variation, and Chris mentioned that Darwin talked about the wild rock pigeons, and Darwin would breed pigeons along with his friends there and get varieties of pigeons. Is that devastating to creation science? Not at all, because what are they? They're still pigeons. That's a point we're trying to make. God has designed within the pigeon kind varieties that we have, and we can look at and breed and all that. But just like puppy dogs, dogs remain dogs, pigeons remain pigeons. So why was Darwin's book so popular? Answer, it wasn't because it was so scientific, but because of its philosophical implication. Darwin's book explained creation without a creator. He explained creation without a creator. And so Darwin's book satisfied a philosophical need that people in his day and today have. And that is to give a purely, as Chris said, a naturalistic explanation for their origin and therefore their destiny as well. So what was the origin of insects? Well, this is taken from a zoology textbook, The Origin of All Bilateral Animals, animals that you can cut down the middle and they'd be the same on each side. We call that the bilateral type of insects there. And over in the far right-hand side of the screen, you see the arthropods, phylum Arthropoda, the arthropods, which are the most numerous of the phyla in the zoological world, according to the late Steve Gould out of Harvard. And so, yes, we can see the animals that you see up there on the screen. You can go to a typical tidal pool here in Washington State or any tidal pool around the world, and you can find a majority of these creatures in this tidal pool. We are not disputing that at all. There is an enormous variety of animals in the living world today. But where's the philosophy? Where's the religion that is shown in this diagram? Answer, those solid blue lines. Solid blue lines indicate that there is direct fossil evidence that would, as you see in that diagram, connect the various kinds of animals. And that's where the religion is. That's where the philosophy is. That's where the bad science is. Because, folks, although we have all these animals, as I just mentioned, on the top of the screen, to extrapolate and to say all these animals came from one kind of common ancestor is unscientific, it's illogical, but most importantly, it's anti-biblical. And so, as one individual said, two evolutionary naturalists said in recently, this is Hickman and his fellow authors, so it's 8 evolutionists who wrote this zoology text for where this quote is from in 2011. Features of the most recent common ancestor of all bilateran animals, and you can see bilateria there in the very center of the screen in the tan box, features of the most common ancestor of all bilateran animals have been much debated. What do we say in creation science? It will always be much debated. Why? Because these creatures were created after their kind. They have no evolutionary ancestors. So right here in the 21st century, they're still asking the questions that Darwin and his secular colleagues were asking and still have no answer. The phylum Arthropod, as I say, is the largest phyla of animals in the biological kingdom. And when it comes to discussing their origin, this came from the University of California website. They have no theological axe to grind. And they're talking about the origin of the arthropods, as you see up there in the screen, from a what? An unknown common ancestor. Again, within creation science circles, we maintain it will always be an unknown common ancestor. They will never find this common ancestor that would supposedly bloom or develop into the various kinds of creatures you see there at the top of the screen. Evolutionists are in a quandary. They simply will not accept the creation explanation. This came from a quote way back in 2015, where the secular evolutionist said, quote, "The question here is how do we go from something that looks nothing like an arthropod to something that looks completely like an arthropod?" I love that quote. What do we say in creation science? We say that arthropods have always been arthropods. See how easy science is? Arthropods have always been arthropods. We don't have to try and scramble and try and deduce or somehow determine what the ancestor might be when we have the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, where the author clearly tells us he created 10 times in Genesis chapter 1 after their kind. According to Strausfield of the University of Arizona, a very, very secular university, he said that paleontologists and evolutionary biologists have yet to agree on exactly how arthropods evolved, especially on what the common ancestor looked like that gave rise to insects. Then again, just a couple of years ago, in a secular website, quote, "There has been a very long," what, class? "Debate about the origin of insects." Remember, Darwin's book is called The Origin of Species. He never talked about the origin of species. As of the year 2012, when this quote was said, there is still a long debate about the origin of insects. What about the infamous tree of life that we see both on video and on TV and in your college and high school textbooks? Great disagreement exists, however, about how the animal phyla are related to one another. So again, these solid lines that you see on the screen there are not found in the fossil record. In other words, there is no direct fossiliferous evidence that would connect, as you see in the purple lines there, these various kinds of animals. That is the unproved, unobserved theory of evolution. But again, all of the creatures that you see listed on the top of the diagrams exist today. The solid lines that would connect them are what? They are deceptive. They are deceptive. Keep that in mind as you watch these programs and you read these in the various secular textbooks. Recent studies have cast doubt on the historical viewpoint that sponges are the sister to all other animal lineages. Sponges, the phylum Porifera, are you kidding me? Evolutionists at one time thought that maybe sponges are our ancestors. How unscientific can you get? How much more refreshing is the biblical model that says that God created after their kind? Well, let's get into the insects very, very quickly. That was just kind of a background regarding the status of zoology today. But when it comes to the arthropod fossils and the molecules that comprise them, one secular zoology textbook said just 3 short years ago, Springer and Holly said, quote, have necessitated major revisions in our understanding of insect evolution. So what these secular zoologists were doing was looking at the fossils, looking at the molecules. You can see two of the molecules up there, and they said, whoop, we have to have major revisions in our understanding of insect evolution. And they will continue to majorly revise, if you will, insect evolution because it simply does not fit the preconceived ideas of macro or vertical evolution. This comes from 2 other zoologists who said recent research is causing zoologists to what? Rethink their perceptions of insect evolution. Rethink their perceptions of insect evolution. Again, without getting redundant, insects have always been insects. A retired zoologist at the University of Liverpool said in 2009, quote, nobody knows where caterpillars came from. Caterpillars are a very, very unique, immature stage of insects. And caterpillars, again, have always been caterpillars. Fossilized insects. Again, Chris was talking about this last hour. As we look to the fossil record, we see the extremely well preserved fossils of various kinds of vertebrates and invertebrates. If you remember what he said, that 95% of all fossils are marine invertebrates. Well, that's a fancy way of saying clams. And so the fossil record really is a record of clams. It's just lots of clams. Clams at the bottom of the fossil record, clams in the middle of the fossil record, clams at the top of the fossil record. Oh, and clams from side to side. It's just lots of clams. Just a whole bunch of clams. Just clams. Lots of clams. And so 95 out of every 100 fossils that you pick up when you're blindfolded would be clams. See how easy science is? Clams, you bet. And so Chris showed some pictures of some of these well-fossilized creatures, whether they're vertebrates, animals with a backbone, or invertebrates, such as the insect you see up there. It looks like they were suddenly and catastrophically buried because of the degree of preservation. The preservation is such that, as was mentioned, there was no predation, there was no scavenging. It looks like they were suddenly captured and preserved in a load of sediment, like you would get with a flood could do something. Very good, a flood could do something like that. As a matter of fact, if you're taking notes this morning, just write this down, please. Floods form fossils. Fast. Floods form fossils fast, you bet. And so the reason why we have these well-preserved fossils is that they must have been suddenly and catastrophically buried like you'd get as described in the book of Genesis, chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 8. A rapid and catastrophic burial. Yes, insects have always been insects. Even if we go back into the fossil record that evolutionists maintain was through millions and millions of years, insects have always been insects. Nature, volume 503, shows the hymenopterids and the coleopterids. The coleoptera are the beetles. Beetles are ubiquitous. They're found all over the world. They are a major foundation of the ecological zonation that we have in the world today, and beetles have always been beetles. The origin, there's that word again, the origin of winged insects, called the pterygoda, is one of the planet's most diverse lineages of creatures. It's assumed to lie in the Devonian, but as the extremely sparse fossil record impedes our understanding of their early diversification, and any well-preserved insect fossil from this time would be particularly valuable. When we translate what this individual said in Nature magazine, volume 494, we find that, yes, insects have always been insects. Pterygote insects, that include the winged insects, appear abruptly in the fossil record. I love that phrase because that's exactly what creation science says. This is a book by Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer, I'm not sure where he is in terms of the flood and geology and all that, but he makes an excellent case in this book, Darwin's Doubt, the explosive origin of animal life and the case for intelligent design. And that is absolutely true. Animals of all sizes and all shapes suddenly appear in the fossil record, or as it says in the quote up there in the bottom of the screen, appear abruptly in the fossil record. As a matter of fact, you could put together a scientific model that talks about abrupt appearance. That people appear abruptly, the rare time that we find them in the fossil record, and we don't find complete human skeletons, but dinosaurs appear abruptly. We can safely say this morning that dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs. Dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs. We love dinosaurs as creation scientists. We call them missionary lizards. And certainly that's true with the clams. Did I mention clams? Clams have always been clams, you bet, and on through the various phyla of animals. And they appear abruptly in the fossil record with no obvious transitional forms. It almost sounds like a creationist is saying that. Certainly, the fossil record, ladies and gentlemen, shouts creation. The oldest known fossil of an insect was far from primitive and had very efficient-looking mandibles, that is, jaw parts, suggesting it was a vociferous eater. Forces the origin of winged insects back about 80 million years, according to a secular researcher. And so we see that this fossilized insect is supposedly 400 million years old, but it's still of the basic insect type that we have today. This is a termite, our friend the termite. Until now, that is, way back in the year February of 2016, the oldest worker and soldier termites were 17 million years old. Now, 5 termite species are reported in 100 million year old amber from Myanmar. And so this is just amazing. Termites have always been termites, and that's simply a subclade of basically, evolutionarily speaking, of ants. So ants have always been ants, termites have always been termites, and no matter how far back you go in the fossil record. Well, what about the origin of insect wings? I love this. This comes from Hickman's zoology text in 2011. He and 7 other evolutionists have written this zoology text, and they said the evolutionary origin of insect wings has long been a what? It's long been a puzzle. Where did insect wings come from? Another secular publication said a whole body fossil impression of a flying insect discovered in the United States dates back to 300 million years ago, and that was said in 2008. And what about the ever reliable source of all information in the world today? Wikipedia. And Wikipedia said the evolution of insect wings has been a subject for what? Debate. What do we say in creation science circles, folks? We would say that winged insects have always been winged insects. They show up in the fossil record as winged insects. And so the evolutionists must take that information and somehow give it a naturalistic spin, a naturalistic explanation, and say, yes, but winged insects are a specialization. They, quote, must have come from a non-winged insect, but there's no indication that that occurred. God created winged insects as winged insects. This is the second oldest known ant, and showing that ants have always been ants. They're a very good impression. Fossilized ants, of course, are quite rare, but when we find them, they're 100% ants. Models of early ant evolution predict that the first ants were solitary, specialist predators. But discoveries of Cretaceous fossils suggest group recruitment and socially advanced behavior among stem group ants. Well, that's quite a mouthful from a 2016 publication. What's a translation? Ants have always been ants. That's what this particular publication was getting at. I think we can distill what they said to say simply that ants, with all of their sophistication, their sociality and everything else, have always been ants. The oldest beetle fossils are in the lower Permian and are approximately 300 million years old. But what are they? They're beetles. They're beetles. The question that we asked this morning is, where is the evidence for beetle evolution? Beetles, again, the Coleoptera, a very foundational part of the zoological makeup of the world today. Beetles have always been beetles. And the International Team of Evolution has made a surprising find that a 20 million year, I don't agree at all, not for a second, on these dates. No pun intended, I don't agree for a second. But anyway, they're discovered belonging to species of aquatic beetles. And so beetles have always been beetles. How about the famous Florida mosquito? Have you seen a Florida mosquito? They're incredible. Okay. Don't get bitten by one of these mosquitoes. It'll just ruin your day. But when you look at mosquitoes, yeah, mosquitoes have always been mosquitoes. And again, there are some species of mosquitoes that do not require a blood meal. Blood-filled mosquito is a fossil first. Imagine that. They have actually found a mosquito fossil, which is rare in itself, but a mosquito fossil with the bloated abdomen carrying traces of blood molecules. Now, I used to teach a little bit about hematology, taught anatomy and physiology at a Christian college, and we got into the makeup of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is that red pigment that makes your blood red. It's made of 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. It is a protein-based molecule. It has a central iron, a ferric iron core to it. But evolutionists are saying that this protein is 46 million years old, and it was stated just 3 years ago. And we certainly would challenge that, especially since this is a proteinaceous-based material. How can it last even 500,000 years? It can't, not even for 500,000 years. We are expected to believe, according to the theory of evolution, that it's 46 million years old. We don't buy that for a second. And there's also oil and plant heme pigments that are found in a formation in Montana. Let's see. I think we already went through that. Praise for God's wonderful works. Psalm 111 says this, and I love this psalm as a zoologist in the Lord's work. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. His work is honorable and glorious. He hath made his wonderful works to be remembered. When I do my research in investigation in parasites, parasitology, even though we see that is a corruption of the creation, we don't believe God created parasites to infect Adam and Eve in the beginning when God looked out in his creation and said it was very good. That came afterwards, right? So we have the creation, we have the corruption of the creation, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, and then we have the curse, right? Creation, the corruption, and the curse, when God cursed the earth with weeds and thorns and thistles. I would suggest possibly, very possibly, that's where parasites came from, a degradation of the original good creation. There's lots of work to be done there. So God cursed the earth with weeds and thorns, thistles, parasites, definitely telemarketers. And so, it's a joke, wish you could have heard it, but anyway, and so we would agree by looking at God's creation, even though it's been corrupted by sin, we agree with what the psalmist says in Psalm 111. Living things, like insects, clearly look like they were designed. So how do evolutionists know they were not designed? And I had to include a picture of an electron micrograph of Solenopsis. If you're not really intimately involved in zoology, you go, well, Solenopsis, what's that? Well, that's the fire ant. And as I lived in Pensacola for 9 years, teaching at Pensacola Christian College, and one of my 3 daughters got caught up in an anthill and was badly stung by these Solenopsis ants here. They inject a type of acid called formic acid. It's the simplest of the carboxylic acid compounds, and so that was kind of a tense time for us. But this particular ant is found in the southern United States. A new study suggests that monarch butterflies use an internal magnetic compass. An internal magnetic compass, are you kidding me, in their antenna to help navigate on their annual migrations from North America to central Mexico. Now, this was reported just 2 short years ago. I got to include an electron micrograph of this. So this is the anterior. This is the front portion, the front end of the antenna of a monarch butterfly using that internal magnetic compass. Now, the antenna of a monarch butterfly is a little bit of nothing. It's just a very, very fine hair. If you've ever seen the monarch butterfly and the antenna that comes from it, this is our friend, the scanning electron microscope photo of the tip of the monarch butterfly antenna. And it shows also dense clusters of what we call in zoology chemoreceptors, receptors that receive chemostatic type of information that is then processed by the monarch butterfly. It is absolutely amazing, some of the discoveries that have recently been made. But I want to share with you some of my favorite insects. For example, the amazing dragonfly. Dragonflies are absolutely incredible. Now, in zoology, on occasion, I've had to try and capture dragonflies. And it takes an act of Congress and a stick of dynamite and a whole long time in order to capture these dragonflies because they're such efficient flyers. So you think, well, Frank, all you have to do is take one of those insect nets and swing and you got them, right? Not even close. Because most, as you can see on the illustration there, most of an insect's head is eyes. 80% of an insect head is nothing more than eyes. And so you start to swing with that insect net and you get about this far and the insect simply goes up, the dragonfly goes down and you miss it. You finish the swing and it's already half a mile behind you. And so it's really frustrating to try and capture something as efficient as the dragonfly. And so in frustration, zoologists, and they're kind of a strange group of people, I think you'd agree with, zoologists decided the best way to capture a dragonfly is using a shotgun. And I'm serious. Not a shotgun with a buckshot, that would ruin your day if you got hit by it, but this kind of buckshot that is basically a modified type of a sand or almost like a talcum powder. And so sure enough, when a dragonfly comes by, you can shoot it with a shotgun and perforate the wings a little bit, just enough to knock it out of the sky, and then you can do the research on them and all that. But dragonflies are amazing, and as Chris showed you in the last hour there, dragonflies have always been dragonflies. See how easy science is? Dragonflies have always been dragonflies. They have been found with about a 2.5-foot wingspan. Some have even been found supposedly with a 3-foot wingspan. So you had very, very large dragonflies in what we call the pre-flood world. And so here is a dragonfly fossil with a very long wingspan showing that, again, according to the fossil record, that's all we have to go by, insects such as a dragonfly have always been insects. A dragonfly barely 1.5 inches long appears to be the animal world's most prolific long-distance traveler, flying not hundreds, but thousands of miles over oceans as it migrates from continent to continent, according to newly published research. A little dragonfly, 1.5 inches long, flying for thousands of miles. Just looking at it in terms of energy acquisition, the insect cannot have too much energy reserves or wouldn't be able to fly efficiently. And certainly it couldn't have too little insect reserves or food reserves, otherwise it would starve to death before it got there. It would have to be, as Goldilocks says, just right. Isn't it amazing how that works out? Dragonflies are expert flyers. They can fly straight down and up or hover like a helicopter. If they can't fly, they would starve because they only eat prey that they can catch while they're flying. So they use their 6 legs to capture things like yummy mosquitoes, and they form a kind of a cage, and then as they're flying, they go ahead and eat whatever insects they find in, for example, waterways. Some adult dragonflies live for only a few weeks, while others live up to a year. Their eyes, they have about 30,000 individual lenses. Fruit flies that we looked at last night have about 750 individual, what we call ommatidia. But dragonflies, as you see in the various pictures here, have upwards of 30,000 individual ommatidia, or lenses. And this is something I used to teach my biology students there. A single ommatidium is a very, very sophisticated structure, and God has designed the dragonfly with 30,000 of these. Dragonflies have almost a 360-degree vision, which is why it's so hard to capture those dragonflies. They keep mosquitoes at bay, and they're indicators of clean water. You can be sure if you're by a body of water and there are dragonflies, it's a clean body of water. One secular publication said a couple of years ago, you might call dragonflies the stunt pilots of the insect world. They wear flashy colors, dart at speeds up to, yes, 30 miles an hour, boast ancestors that predate dinosaurs, and of course that's from an evolutionary publication. But let's look very quickly this morning at the dragonfly larva. Here is a very good picture of a dragonfly larva, which has been called the tiger of the pond because it stays underwater all the time. It has gills in its rear end, and that's how it breathes. And it has a voracious appetite. So if you go online later on this afternoon and type in dragonfly larva on YouTube, you will be able to see these things in action. They are absolutely amazing. They have a double jaw joint that comes down and shoots out and has 2 very wicked, poisonous, thorny type projections in the end of their mandible, which is also called a mask. And using that mask, and this is an invertebrate, this is an animal without a backbone, it is so voracious, it's so savage that when it's really hungry, it will reach out in a fraction of a second, shoot out this mask, and grab anything going by, even to the extent of vertebrates, like the minnow that you see there in the illustration, and tadpoles, and even small frogs are grabbed by this very, very hungry, predatory larval stage of the dragonfly. This is an actual picture showing a dragonfly larva. It has just captured a minnow and injects enzymes that degrade the internal anatomy of the creature, and then it sucks up the material there. So this is a dragonfly nymph. This is obviously an artist's reconstruction here, and it reaches out and grabs something like a tadpole or a minnow or something like that. And here's another picture, dragonfly larva. The labium is extended to capture the prey. Look at those wicked pincers there. Can you imagine? Sometimes fishermen, as they're digging around in the side of a bank, of a stream or a pond, trying to get some worms or maybe some grubs or one like that, they'll get nailed on the end of their finger by these dragonfly larvae. And it's very, very painful. It hurts. And so here is a picture that a photographer took of the dragonfly larva, and you can see the 2 wicked pincers on the end there. What he did was, it was unfortunate, he had his camera and he decided, and this thing was alive and very, very angry, as you might imagine. And so when he lowered his camera and he leaned forward, you can see the mask there, and this dragonfly larva was very upset. Boom! Oh boy, I tell you, almost got nailed on the end of his nose there, but he was able to avoid it very quickly. Did anybody jump? And so we can see that these things are are called the tiger of the pond. Well, that brings us to another type of arthropod called the giant sea scorpion. Look what this one evolutionist said. We have known for some time that the fossil record yields monster millipede, supersized scorpions, colossal cockroaches, we still have those in Texas, by the way, and jumbo dragonflies, end quote. But, he said, we never realized until now how big some of these ancient, creepy crawlies were. I give you the giant sea scorpion next to a 6-foot man. And this creature did exist in what we call the pre-flood world. I'm kind of glad these creatures are extinct, aren't you? And so I've been challenged by some people. They say, Frank, I got to see chapter and verse on that. In other words, I want to see the scientific notation that would show just how big these things are, or is that just an exaggeration? So I went to the New York State Conservationist just 3 years ago and got the information. Yes, indeed. This secular publication said, quote, some species grew to 9 foot long, the largest arthropods ever. The largest arthropods ever. Can you imagine getting pulled underwater, screaming and kicking by something like this? But you know, folks, that's not quite far from the truth, because do you remember we saw a fossilized dragonfly, almost a 3-foot wingspan, right? Which we believe was formed during the Genesis flood 4,700 years ago. Well, if it's a creature, a dragonfly with almost a 3-foot wingspan, let's go back a little bit to its larval stage. In its larval stage, that larva would have been big, right? It would have been big to become a 3-foot span adult dragonfly. So you can imagine getting nailed by something like that as you waded around in the pre-flood waters. Well, bees. I love bees, and unfortunately now they are on the endangered species list. I never in my wildest dreams, especially as a zoologist, would ever live to hear that honeybees would be on the endangered species list, but they have been introduced there because they're dying off by the millions and millions. Psalm 19 says, yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. And so we find an intrepid young lady that's covered with bees there. There are some species of bees, and you have to determine this as a zoologist to find out what bees are stinging bees and other bees are what we call stingless bees. Well, when Dr. Steve Austin was working with the Institute for Creation Research back in the late 1990s, he invited a bunch of us to come to a wadi. A wadi is a geologic formation within the desert just east of San Diego to look at some of the geology there. And so we went out there on a Saturday afternoon, and they set up a table there in the wadi and started cutting up watermelon, just like watermelon we have on the table out there in the back. And of course, the watermelon, as it was cut open, attracted a whole bunch of bees. And so all these bees are coming to the watermelon to feed on it and all that, and everybody just stayed away, except for one individual who looked at the bees and discovered that they were a stingless variety. So I just waded right into the center there and was enjoying all this ice-cold watermelon. Nobody else would believe me when I said that they are a stingless form of bees, so I had all the watermelon I could handle to eat. Well, the electromagnetic spectrum is something that Dr. DeYoung knows a whole lot more about than I do, but we do know within the entire electromagnetic spectrum, from radio waves on one end to the very, very penetrating gamma rays on the other, we have approximately right in the center what we call the visible spectrum of light. God has designed animals to see outside of the visible spectrum of light. For example, in the infrared, we have some predatory type snakes that have special they're the pit vipers, and they have special pits in their head where they can pick up infrared waves. Then on the other side, we have creatures such as the honeybees and other insects that can see in the ultraviolet range. Now, people cannot see in those two extreme areas. We can just see in the various colors as you see there in the center of the screen. But honeybees are unique in that they can see in the ultraviolet. So unique, in fact, that when we look on the left-hand side of the screen there, we see a nice, beautiful dandelion. But the bee, using its photoreception when it comes to ultraviolet ability to see in the ultraviolet sees the nectar guides that you see in the white and black picture on the right-hand side of the screen. So people can see the yellow, but bees are more interested in the nectar guides as they go to get that nectar meal. Here's the same thing with the trumpet vine flower. We can see the beautiful yellow flower there, but bees, with their with their ability to see the UV spectrum, can see the nectar guides, again, that guides and directs them to the source of the nectar. So nectar guides are visible to bees, but not to people. And the ultraviolet image generates 3 rings of color to actually guide the bees. How did that come about, folks? Did that come about by time and chance and natural processes? Or do we look at it and say, here's an example of plan and purpose and special creation? I think the latter, not the former. When we're talking about bees, it's fascinating to look at a bee and understand that it has a brain about the size of a single grass seed. A single grass seed, which has approximately 950,000 neurons, that is, nerve cells that make up the honeybee brain. It doesn't sound like very much, and really it isn't. But the Creator, in His infinite wisdom, has packed in such an ability for the bees to do things that were unheard of just a half century ago. And so here are some grass seeds compared, for example, to the lead of a pencil there, giving you an idea as to how tiny the honeybee brain is. And this is a CAT scan of a bee brain here. It looks strange. Foraging insects like bees have to learn to deal with a complex array of sensory, landscape, cues while they search for pollen. Researchers at the Vision Center have demonstrated that even on days when the sun doesn't shine, bees can navigate to and from honey source by reading the pattern of polarized light. We can't see polarized light, and it is incredibly sophisticated to be able to determine polarized light, and yet bees can do that. Also, certain kinds of shrimp can do that too, and do it very, very effectively. Polarized light in the sky, and then explain to other bees where to find it with their famous waggle dance. And we've all seen that on nature programs, haven't we, where the bee goes into the hive and all the other bees or friends are gathered around, and this bee begins to do its famous waggle dance, giving specific directions as to where this bee found that nectar trove. Well, just as we're getting over just the incredible sophistication and ability of the bees, we see that there is what we call in zoology a countercurrent heat exchange that helps maintain a high temperature in the thorax where the flight muscles are located, allowing the endothermic insect to fly in winter. Some bees have this ability, this countercurrent heat exchanger that actually generates heat, and also some species of moth have this as well, a countercurrent heat exchanger. Well, speaking of moths, let's look at the moth up there and help me out this morning. What is the gender of this moth here? Female or male? Now, before you answer, you got a 50-50 chance, right? So what gender do you suppose that moth is? Somebody said male. You're 100% correct, yes. So this is a male moth, and we can see the antenna array emanating from its skull there, its head, not skull, but the head, and this antenna array is very, very detailed and sophisticated. Most information a moth receives comes from its highly developed antenna, which provides it with an incredibly sensitive sense of smell. The antennae of male moths are so sensitive in some species that they can detect a single molecule of a female moth's sex pheromone in 1 cubic yard of air. Now, translated, this is what happens. You've got the male moth just sitting there minding his own business. A female moth may be 8 miles away, and as long as it's upwind from the male moth, she will release these chemical pheromones. And pheromones are unique as biochemical compounds, but also they're very, very effective in small concentrations. Just like us here this afternoon, you have in your bloodstream at least 30 different hormones that are going through your blood vessels right now. And these hormones act in the long term to affect various changes in your body physiologically. But what we have here with this moth is the male moth is sitting there upwind 8 miles away as a female moth. She releases the pheromones, and as the pheromones travel towards a male moth, they become diluted, right? Just like when you put a drop of ink in some water in, for example, a swimming pool. There's dilution that occurs. But the design features that you see on the right-hand side of the screen there are so well that all it takes, listen, all it takes is one female pheromone molecule to strike this very sophisticated antenna array that you see there. Just one molecule is all it takes, and it rings a bell. And the male moth, with just one molecule that strikes it, starts looking around saying, hey, whoa. And it works, right? Because we still have those moths today, don't we? So we know it works, even at greatly dilute concentrations. Well, this is one of my favorite type of creatures. This is the Lepidoptera, which is the moth. The group of Lepidoptera includes the butterflies and the moths, and this is called the Morpho butterfly. The Morpho butterfly. And when I went down to Lima twice through a couple of years, I would go to the marketplace there in Lima, Peru, and I would look for these these Morpho butterfly displays in a glass case with the wooden surrounding it. And I would buy these, and then I'd bring them back, and when I would speak in churches, I would show the Morpho butterfly. I did manage to break all of the displays that I had because they're made of just very delicate wood and glass. But the Morpho butterfly is unique, folks, because you can see the iridescent sheen of a kind of a turquoise blue color. Do you see that? And so, you know, at least a century and a half, 2 centuries ago, naturalists, biologists decided, well, these butterflies must have some kind of pigment molecule. You've heard of pigments, right? And so when they look into the scales of the Morpho butterfly, they were expecting to find cells containing pigment. You could smear it around there and get a purple, a turquoise color on your fingertips, right? Wrong. There are no pigment cells that secrete this kind of color here. And so for decades and decades, scientists were scratching their head asking the question, why is it that it has such a beautiful color here, but there are no pigment molecules? There's no pigmentation. The same question was asked regarding invertebrates found in tidal pools around the world. Some of these invertebrates had the same iridescent color, but they had no pigment cells. The same thing, for example, with the blue jay. You've seen these blue jays with the beautiful iridescent feathers. Same situation, no pigment cells. And so the mystery deepened as to how you would have these colors portrayed that are so obvious, as you see on the screen there, with no pigment cells. And so they went and they got the amazing blue color. It comes from complex nanostructures. I talked about nanostructures last night as evidence for design, but these nanostructures in the wing scales. So the wing scales of the Morpho butterfly are much like shingles on a roof, aren't they? And if you take a single wing scale, that's microscopic. You need a microscope to see individual scales there. And so they would blow up these individual scales and not find any pigment cells, but they did using an electron microscope, magnifying things thousands of times. They found the nano structures. Nano means incredibly, incredibly small. As a matter of fact, you can only see with the scanning electron microscope. So let's increase the magnification thousands of times using the scanning electron microscope. We see the scale there, which looks like a shingle on a roof of a house, but the scale here is magnified thousands and thousands of times using the scanning electron microscope. Here's what they found. Something completely unexpected. So if you increase the magnification of the scales, you see something called cuticles, and then increasing, as you see on the screen there, 15,000 times, you get that ridged effect there. See those ribs, those ridges? What's that all about? Well, whatever they are, they're incredibly small. And here's where the beauty kind of shows up. Right now, these lights are composed of what, class? What are they composed of? White light. All the, remember for junior high? All the colors of the rainbow. Very good. So white light has all the colors of the rainbow. And if you remember, your teacher would take a prism and they'd shine white light through the prism, and what would show up on the wall? A rainbow. Yeah, you remember that. And so what happens is white light striking these structures that you see there, those white and black structures, those ribbed affairs there, the white light would get absorbed. And the nature of light is such that when light strikes an object, one of three things happens. Either the light will go straight through the object, light will be reflected back to the viewer, or the light will be absorbed by the structures there. So what happens with white light striking these structures that you see on the screen there, all the wavelengths of light are absorbed by those ribbed structures you see there, except for blue. Very good. See how easy science is? Except for the blue light, which is cut at a certain wavelength, which is reflected back to our eyes, and we take in that turquoise blue color. So as you see, white light, for example, from the sun, strikes those structures that we just looked at in the previous slide, reflecting up to 80% of the incident blue light, as they call it in physics. Now, evolutionists say it's all due to beneficial mutations. That's why we have that beautiful blue color. It's due to those structures forming in such a way through evolutionary processes, time, chance, and natural processes, producing the kind of structures you see there, giving us, through beneficial mutations, that beautiful iridescent turquoise blue sheen. Well, I'm not here this morning to say that there's no such thing as beneficial mutations, because once in a great while, yes, we admit there are such things as beneficial mutations. They are not as incredibly beneficial as to give you all these cartoon characters that we read about on occasion in the movies and all that. They're very, very subtle mutations that on occasion might be termed beneficial. And we have to be careful how we define our terms. But a vast majority of mutations are either neutral or they're deleterious. They're bad mutations. So the idea of beneficial mutations, that's kind of, do we have any English majors here? What do they call that? An oxymoron, right. It's kind of like saying jumbo shrimp. Is that an oxymoron? Airline food, rap music. I'm getting nowhere with these. Don, did you get those? Or what about Microsoft Works? Oh, good. All right, good. Okay, so those are some of the oxymorons there. But beneficial mutations, I don't think so, especially when it comes to describing the Morpho butterfly characteristics there. Some evolutionists like to talk about four-winged fruit flies. Way back in the early 1980s, I had a debate with a guy who was my age, a PhD biologist at Denver University. And boy, he was not happy to be debating me. I put my hand out, shake his hand, he wouldn't accept it. But anyway, he showed up on the screen during the debate, a four-winged fruit fly, and then he turned to me and said, "What are you going to say about that?" Boy, is there ever a lot to say about a four-winged fruit fly. Basically, it doesn't fly, right? So what would natural selection do to such a creature? Out of the gene pool. In other words, it would make a good hot lunch for a predator, wouldn't it? And so the four-winged fruit fly is a real bad example of a quote-unquote beneficial mutation. Speaking of fruit flies, they started mutating the homeobox genes. I won't get too much into genetics this morning, but homeobox genes are very, very important during embryonic development, both in invertebrates and vertebrates. We have homeobox genes during our embryonic development. And sure enough, if you were to mutate some of these homeobox genes, it turns the antenna of the fruit fly into legs. And we call that in genetics the Antipedia mutation. And we can see the benefits of having legs coming out of a fruit fly's head instead of antenna, right? I mean, the benefits are enormous. I don't think so. And so, yeah, that is a mutation, but it's certainly not what we would call a beneficial mutation. Well, Frank, what are you doing with that genetics textbook up there? This is a university-level genetics textbook. It was published in 2012. I got to change my slides a little bit, but I checked that book from cover to cover. It's in my office right now at ICR. I checked that book cover to cover for a list of beneficial mutations that would document some kind of benefit. I didn't find a section of the textbook on that, nor did I find a chapter on beneficial mutations, nor did I find a section within a chapter on beneficial mutations. I didn't find a table or a summarization of beneficial mutations. I found No examples of beneficial mutations, none. We still say, however, that there are on very rare occasions something that we might term a beneficial mutation. They do that with bacteria, but nothing that would cause anybody to do cartwheels in celebration that would turn molecules into men, particles into people, or such kinds of transformation. This is a very thick book, 751 pages that address evolution, and it's in the 3rd edition, but there's only 2 pages out of the 751 that address beneficial mutations, and that's mostly just theoretical. It's not the chapter and verse, the reference and citation of the scientific journals that would lead one to conclude that we are awash in beneficial mutations. Oop, going the wrong way there. So finally, let me say something about the ommatidia of the bee, and then we'll be done. The brain of the bee is composed of a mere 950,000 neurons, or nerve cells, 0.01% of the neurons of a 3-pound human brain. Using this tiny bee brain and associated vision, bees have been able to solve complicated color puzzles and even recognize human faces. Bees can recognize human faces. That's unbelievable. But they're able to do that by using 6,300 ommatidia that I talked about earlier.